There is a moment you know well. The room is quiet, the day is done. And just when you expected some peace to arrive, something else comes instead. A hum, a pressure, a thought that does not quite have a name. You are not in danger. Nothing is wrong, not exactly. And yet your chest holds something tight, the way a hand holds a stone it cannot remember picking up. If that sounds familiar, then tonight is for you. Not because this conversation will fix anything, but because something in you has been waiting for someone to say, that feeling is not a flaw, it is a signal. And it has been trying to speak to you for a long time. Tonight, we are going to sit with the work of a psychologist named Rollo May. He spent his life studying anxiety, not to eliminate it, not to medicate it into silence, but to understand what it is actually saying. He believed with everything he had that anxiety points towards something real, something necessary, something that belongs to you. And here is the first thing you need to hear. You are not failing at being calm. You are someone whose inner life is still alive, still reaching, still asking questions that matter. And that is not a problem. That is a beginning. By the time this conversation ends, you may not have all the answers, but you might find that the anxiety you have been carrying is less a wound and more a compass, and that changes everything. Hold that gently for now. There are two kinds of anxiety. Most people never learn the difference. And for years, they carry the heavier one without knowing there was ever another option. We will come back to that. But first, a question. What if the feeling you have been trying to outrun is not chasing you, but following you? Not to harm you, but to show you something you have not been willing to stop and see. Just let that sit. Tonight, we are not in a hurry. There is nowhere to be. The night is patient, and so is this. Let your breathing settle where it is. Not deeper, not slower, just as it is. Rollo May was born in 1909 in a small town in Ohio. He grew up in a house full of tension, a household where stability was hard to come by, and feeling safe was never quite guaranteed. His parents divorced. His sister struggled with serious mental illness. The ground beneath his childhood was never entirely solid. And yet, or perhaps because of this, he grew into someone who understood instability from the inside, not as a diagnosis, as a lived experience. He went on to study theology, then psychology. He spent years asking the questions that never quite fit into tidy textbooks. Why do people suffer in the ways they do? What does fear actually mean? Is anxiety something to be treated or something to be understood? The answer, when it finally came, changed his life. And it might change yours. There is a quiet detail that will matter later. Something that happened to May when he was in his early 30s that became the turning point for everything he believed. We will get there. But for now, let the question rest in the background, warm and unhurried. What is your anxiety trying to say? Not what it sounds like at its loudest. not the worst-case scenario it conjures at 3 in the morning, the real thing beneath it, the signal before it became noise. You may not know the answer tonight. That is fine. Sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is sit with a question they cannot yet answer and simply stay in the room with it. That is where we begin. Chapter 2. The Signal Beneath Fear. There is a difference between pain and information. Pain says something is wrong. Information says something is happening. They often arrive together, but they are not the same. Rollo May spent decades trying to convince the world of this distinction when it came to anxiety. He argued, gently but firmly, that what we call anxiety is almost always carrying something real, a threat to something we value, a confrontation with something we have not yet faced, a signal that the self is being asked to grow or choose or change. He did not say anxiety feels good. It does not. It is uncomfortable by design. But discomfort, May believed, is not the same as damage. Think of a smoke alarm. When it goes off, you do not say the alarm is broken. You look for what it is responding to. The alarm is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is telling you something needs your attention. Anxiety, in May's view, works the same way. The problem is not the signal. The problem is when we spend all our energy trying to silence the alarm without ever asking what set it off. And here is where it becomes personal. You have probably spent time trying to manage your anxiety. Breathe through it, rationalize it, push it down with work or screens or busyness. And sometimes that works, for a while, but it tends to come back, often louder, often at the worst possible hour. May would say that is because the signal has not been received. The anxiety is patient. It will wait. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Feel where your body is resting right now. There is nothing you need to do with any of this tonight. Just listen. May was deeply influenced by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who lived more than a century before him. Kierkegaard wrote that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He meant something precise by that. When you are free, truly free, you can go in any direction. You can become any number of things. And that openness, that vast possibility stretching out in every direction, is not just exciting. It is terrifying, because if you can become anything, then you are also responsible for who you become. Anxiety, for Kierkegaard, was the feeling of standing at the edge of that freedom and looking down. May took this idea and carried it further. He said that anxiety is not just about freedom in the philosophical sense. It is about everything we hold essential to who we are. Our sense of worth, our relationships, our meaning, our sense that life is going somewhere. When any of those things feels threatened, anxiety rises. It is not irrational. It is appropriate. The trick is learning to listen to it rather than run. Now, there is something in this idea that tends to resist being heard the first time. Something quiet, but important. We planted a seed earlier about two kinds of anxiety, one that serves you and one that does not. The difference between them is not about how loud they are, it is about what you do with them. We are getting closer to that distinction, but not yet. First, a story. A man in his mid-50s sits in a doctor's office. He has been coming here for 3 years with the same complaint. Trouble sleeping, a persistent sense of dread he cannot name, a feeling that something is wrong, even on good days. He has tried medication, he has tried exercise, he has tried keeping a routine so steady it leaves no room for the feeling to breathe. And still it comes. The doctor this time asks a different question. Not, what does the anxiety feel like? But, what is the anxiety about? The man is quiet for a long time. Then he says, I think I am afraid I have lived the wrong life. That silence in the room is not emptiness. That is the signal finally being heard. The anxiety was not broken. It was waiting. And now we are close to the real point. Chapter 3. Innocence before awareness. There is a kind of peace that comes from not knowing. A child runs across a field and does not think about falling. Not because falling is unlikely, but because the concept of falling is not yet part of how the child inhabits the world. The future has not yet arrived. Consequence has not yet become real. There is only this grass, this air, this moment of pure forward motion. Rollo May called this kind of peace innocence. He was not nostalgic about it. He understood that it does not last, it cannot, and the loss of it is not a tragedy. It is the beginning of something necessary. But understanding what we lose when innocence ends helps us understand what anxiety actually is. Because anxiety, in May's view, is precisely what happens in the space between innocence and awareness. It is the feeling of waking up to the weight of things, of realizing that choices have consequences, that time moves in one direction, that some doors once closed stay closed. That waking up is not pleasant, but it is the beginning of real life. There is a moment, somewhere in childhood or adolescence or sometimes much later, when a person stops simply living and starts thinking about living. They begin to notice they are choosing. They begin to feel the pressure of those choices. And something that was once effortless, the act of simply being, becomes complicated. That complication is not a malfunction. It is the emergence of selfhood. Think of it this way. Before a person becomes aware of who they are, they cannot truly grow. They can only exist. The awareness, even when it is uncomfortable, is what makes change possible. It is what makes growth possible. It is what makes a life deliberately chosen, rather than simply stumbled through. Let your breath come easy for a moment. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. Nothing needs solving right now. May spent his early adult years studying theology before turning to psychology. And in that theological background, he found a story that helped him understand what he was trying to articulate about anxiety and Innocence. The story of the garden. The story of the moment when awareness arrived and everything became more complicated. He did not read it literally. He read it as a map. Before awareness, there is simplicity. After awareness, there is responsibility. And in between, there is anxiety. That trembling moment when the old life has ended and the new one has not yet taken shape. That in between is not a mistake. It is the most human place there is. A woman once described something like this to her therapist. She said, "I think I was happier before I started asking questions about my life. And then, after a pause, but I also feel more real now, more real at a cost." That cost is part of what May was trying to honor with his work. He wanted people to stop treating the cost as a mistake, to stop feeling ashamed of the anxiety that comes with being aware, to recognize it as the price of consciousness, and to carry that price with a little more grace. In 1571, the philosopher Michel de Montaigne retired from public life into a stone tower in Bordeaux. He had lost his closest friend. He had lost his father. He had watched his first child die. And somewhere in that accumulation of loss, his innocence of a different kind had ended. He climbed the stairs of his tower, and he did not try to rebuild the old life. He began to think about the one he actually had, what it meant, what he believed, who he was when no one was watching. He invented, in that tower, something we now call the personal essay. The loss of innocence, in the deepest sense, is always the beginning of something. And this is where the path forks quietly. Chapter 4, Freedom and Inner Trembling. Kierkegaard had a phrase he used when trying to describe the experience of genuine freedom. He said it was like standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down, not from a cliff, but from within yourself. A vertigo not of heights, but of possibility. He called it the dizziness of freedom. Rollo May read those words during the darkest period of his own life, and something shifted. He said, years later, that Kierkegaard had named what he had been experiencing, but could not articulate. And in that naming, something in him quieted enough to begin thinking clearly. May was in his early 30s when he contracted tuberculosis. This was before antibiotics, before the treatments we now take for granted. He was sent to a sanatorium in upstate New York, where the main prescription was rest, mountain air, and time. An enormous amount of time. He had been a busy man, a restless man, in the way that young intellectuals often are, and suddenly he had nothing but hours. Long, unstructured, uncertain hours. And in those hours, the anxiety that had always been somewhere in the background grew impossible to ignore. So he read Kierkegaard. And what he found there was not comfort. Exactly. But it was something more useful than comfort. He found a framework, a way of understanding what he was feeling that made it something other than a catastrophe. Anxiety, Kierkegaard had written, is not the experience of being trapped, it is the experience of being free. free in a way that is almost too much to hold. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Let the next breath be a little slower. May came out of that sanatorium changed. Not cured of anxiety, but changed in his relationship to it. He had stopped fighting the trembling and started listening to what it was pointing toward. He returned to his studies. He earned his doctorate at the age of 40. He began writing. And almost everything he wrote came back to that central insight he had found in a mountain sanatorium, reading a Danish philosopher by lamplight. Freedom is real, and its weight is real. But the trembling that comes with it is not a warning to go back. It is a sign that you are standing at a genuine threshold. Think about the moments in your own life that have come with the most anxiety: the job change, the end of a relationship, the child who grew up and left, the question you kept putting off until it refused to be put off any longer. Those moments trembled, not because something was going wrong, but because something was real. There is a quieter layer beneath that. The situations that produce the most anxiety are almost never the ones without stakes. They are the ones where something actually matters. Where you could fail, yes, but also where you could succeed in ways that would change everything. Where the choice in front of you is connected to something you genuinely care about. Anxiety, May argued, is the companion of genuine stakes. Where there is no caring, there is no anxiety. And so, in a strange way, the presence of anxiety is proof of life, proof of investment, proof that the person standing in that trembling moment has not yet gone numb. The danger is not the trembling. The danger is when a person decides the trembling is unbearable and begins to arrange their life so they never have to feel it again. That is a different kind of story, and it has a different kind of ending. We will get there, but tonight, let the dizziness of freedom be something other than an enemy. Let it be, just for this hour, something you simply notice. It is telling you where the real things are. Chapter 5, Anxiety and Becoming. There is an old idea in philosophy that says we are not finished things. We are not statues, complete and defined, waiting to be discovered. We are more like rivers, always moving, always shaping the ground beneath us, always arriving somewhere we did not quite expect. Rollo May took this idea seriously. He believed that human beings are always in the process of becoming, not becoming something fixed and final, just becoming, always a little different than we were, always a little further along, or a little lost, or a little closer to something true. And becoming, he said, requires anxiety, not as a cost to be minimized, as a feature of the process. When something in you is reaching forward into a future that does not yet exist, the gap between where you are and where you are going is experienced as anxiety. That gap is real. The future is genuinely uncertain. The outcome is genuinely unknown. And the self that will exist on the other side is genuinely not yet formed. That is worth sitting with. Most of us were taught to treat anxiety as a sign of weakness, as something the stronger more together version of ourselves would not experience. We watched people who seemed calm and assumed they had figured something out that we had not. But May spent his career sitting with people who had eliminated their anxiety, and he found that the calm they had achieved was not peace. It was flatness, a kind of emotional anesthesia that had taken the anxiety away, along with much of everything else. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. You do not need to do anything with this. Just listen. Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps, came to a similar understanding from a very different direction. He observed in those extreme conditions that the people who had something to become toward, a purpose, a person, a meaning, a task waiting on the other side of survival, endured in ways that those without that orientation often did not. Becoming, even in the darkest circumstances, was a form of life force. Frankl wrote that in those camps, what was stripped away was everything except the last human freedom, the freedom to choose one's attitude. That freedom, and the anxiety that came with it, was not a burden. It was proof that the self was still present, still reaching. May found this confirmation of his own thinking. The anxiety of becoming is the inner experience of freedom not yet resolved. It is the feeling of standing at a genuine crossroads, genuinely uncertain, genuinely responsible for which direction you take. It is not comfortable, but it is alive. A woman once described it this way. She was in her late 40s, recently divorced after 20 years of marriage. She said she had expected to feel relief or grief or anger. Instead, she felt anxious in a way she could not name. A humming in her chest that went on for weeks. Her therapist, who had read May, asked her to consider a different interpretation. What if the anxiety was not about the loss? What if it was about the possibility, about all the directions her life could now go, and the weight of having to choose? She thought about that for a long time, and then she said, if that is true, the anxiety is not telling me I failed, it is telling me I am free. That shift, that quiet, almost imperceptible shift in how a feeling is understood. That is what May spent his life trying to offer. Not the elimination of anxiety, the understanding of it. And once you understand it, once you can feel the signal beneath the noise, something changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the weight shifts. And from that slight shift, becoming becomes possible again. Chapter 6. The Birth of Selfhood. Here is something most people are never told. The self is not something you are given, it is something you build. Slowly, awkwardly, over decades, through choices made and unmade, through things you chose to face and things you ran from, through every moment you acted from your own center rather than from someone else's expectation. The self is constructed, and the construction is never finished. Rollo May understood this in the bone-deep way that only comes from having had the construction threatened. His own sense of self had been put under enormous pressure, by a difficult childhood, by illness, by years of uncertainty. And in that pressure, he learned what the self actually is. It is not your reputation. It is not your role. It is not the way other people describe you when you are not in the room. The self, in May's understanding, is the experiencing center, the place from which you feel, choose, value, and engage with the world. It is not a fixed thing, but it is a real thing. And when that center is threatened, anxiety rises. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the blanket or the couch or whatever is holding you right now. Just breathe. The birth of selfhood, May argued, is always an anxious event, because to become a self means to separate, to differentiate, to say in some way, I am this, not that. I believe this, not that. I will go this way, not that way. And separation, even when it is healthy, even when it is exactly what needs to happen, carries a trembling. A child who begins to have opinions different from the parent feels it. The teenager who discovers their values are not simply inherited feels it. The adult who finally says no to a life path they were pushed toward and yes to one that comes from within, they feel it most of all. The trembling is the announcement that a real self is taking shape. Kierkegaard, in the lonely streets of Copenhagen, understood this perhaps better than anyone of his century. He walked for hours each day, alone, thinking thoughts that did not fit the social world around him. He could have quieted those thoughts, could have made himself more agreeable, more comfortable, more at home in the conventions of his time. He chose not to, and the anxiety that came with that choice, the dizziness of his own freedom, became the raw material of his most important writing. He wrote that anxiety is not a flaw in the soul, it is the soul taking itself seriously. Now, here is the quiet difficulty. Not everyone who feels anxious is in the process of building a genuine self. Sometimes the anxiety signals something different. Sometimes it signals a self that has been too long pressured, too long performing for others, too long arranged around the needs and expectations of everyone except its own center. And in those cases, the anxiety is not the problem. The performance is the problem. The anxiety is the solution. Trying to be heard. There is a reason this feels familiar. Most people who struggle with chronic anxiety are not weak. They are often the most sensitive, most perceptive, most inwardly alive people in any room. They feel the gap between who they are and who they are being asked to be. And that gap is uncomfortable, as gaps should be. The self wants to close that gap, and anxiety is how it asks. Something changes when you see it from this angle. Chapter 7. Why growth feels dangerous. There is a paradox at the heart of change. We want to grow. Almost everyone does. Ask anyone in any honest moment, and they will tell you they want to be better, wiser, more at peace, more alive. The desire for growth is one of the most universal things about being human. And yet, almost every genuine moment of growth arrives accompanied by something that feels like danger. Rollo May thought carefully about why this is. His answer had to do with what growth actually requires. Growth requires leaving something behind. It requires moving out of a known position into an unknown one. It requires the willingness to be, for a period, neither what you were nor what you are becoming. That in-between state is inherently anxious, because it is genuinely uncertain. There is no guarantee on the other side, no promise that the new self will be better than the old one, or that the new direction will be more fulfilling than the familiar one. The uncertainty is real, and to move through it requires trust. Trust in yourself, in the process, in the possibility that what is uncomfortable now might become solid ground later. That kind of trust does not come easily, especially after a life that has given you reasons to doubt. But here is the part that matters. Staying where you are is not safe. It only feels safe. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Let your eyes close if they want to. You do not have to follow every word. The parts that matter will find you. May observed something interesting in his clinical work. The people who came to him most burdened by anxiety were rarely those who had taken too many risks. They were far more often those who had taken too few. People who had arranged their lives so carefully around the avoidance of discomfort that they had gradually eliminated nearly everything that might have been meaningful. The safety they had constructed was real, but so was the cost. What they had avoided was not just pain. They had also avoided growth, avoided the becoming that was available to them, avoided the self that was waiting on the other side of the risks they had not taken, and the anxiety which they had been trying so hard to avoid by staying safe was now being generated by the unlived life itself. The things we do not do have weight. The choices we do not make still press on us. The person we might have become does not disappear just because we chose not to become them. They wait, and the waiting is its own kind of pressure. There is a story that stays with many people who hear it. A man in his early 60s came to May's colleague for therapy. He was successful by every external measure, but he had not written the book he had always meant to write, had not had the conversation with his father he had always meant to have, had not learned the instrument that had waited in the corner of his living room for 20 years. He came not because of a crisis, but because of a quiet, persistent wait. His therapist asked him, "What are you afraid of if you start?" He thought for a while and said, "That I might succeed, and then I would have to face all the years I didn't." There is a quieter layer beneath fear. Sometimes growth feels dangerous because it illuminates the distance between where we are and where we could have been. And that illumination, however necessary, is its own kind of grief. May did not ask people to ignore that grief. He asked them to carry it forward and begin anyway. Chapter 8, The Psychology of Threat. Here is a precise and careful idea. May defined anxiety as the experience of a threat to something we hold essential to who we are. Not every fear is anxiety. If a car swerves toward you, the fear you feel is acute, physical, immediate. That is not anxiety. That is survival. Anxiety is different. It is slower, more pervasive, harder to pin to a single cause. It lives in the background. It colors mornings before you have had a reason to feel it. It follows you into moments that should feel safe. This is because the threat that produces anxiety is not usually physical. It is existential. It threatens the self. And the self, as we have seen, is not a single thing. It is a whole structure of values, beliefs, relationships, meanings, and commitments. When any of these is threatened, anxiety rises. This is why anxiety can feel disproportionate to circumstances. The situation may seem manageable, but the thing the situation is touching, the self beneath the situation, may feel genuinely at risk. Someone criticizes your work. On the surface, this is a small event. But if your sense of worth is deeply tied to your performance, if you have built your identity on competence and achievement, that criticism touches something structural, something load-bearing. And the anxiety that follows is proportionate not to the criticism itself, but to what the criticism threatens. Notice the weight of your body for a moment. Just here, just now. Nothing is being threatened right now. Marcus Aurelius, writing in a military tent near the Danube River in the 2nd century, understood this kind of structural threat. He commanded the most powerful empire in the world, and yet he wrote in his private journal night after night about his own fears, about the fear of dying without having lived well, about the fear of losing his character in the pressures of power, about the things he held essential to his identity as a person, not as an emperor, that felt, on difficult nights, as though they might not survive what his role required of him. He did not write these things to perform vulnerability. He wrote them because the writing was how he tended to the structure of his self, how he made sure the foundations were still solid. The threat he feared was not external, it was the internal one, the slow erosion of who he actually was, under the relentless pressure of who he was required to be. That is an ancient problem, but it is also a very modern one. The anxiety most people carry is not usually fear of physical harm. It is the fear that something essential in them is being eroded by the demands of the job, by the pace of life, by years of performing for approval rather than living from the inside. And the anxiety signals that. It says something that matters is at risk. The question is whether you trust the signal enough to ask what it is pointing toward. Because the threat it identifies is not always the threat it appears to be. The job stress may be pointing toward a values conflict. The relationship anxiety may be pointing toward a fear of being truly known. The fear that arrives on Sunday nights may be pointing toward a life that has drifted from something important. The anxiety is doing its job, which means something more is available here. Chapter 9. Normal anxiety, neurotic anxiety. This is the distinction May worked hardest to clarify, because without it, all anxiety gets lumped together into a single problem that demands a single solution. Make it stop. And that is exactly the wrong approach for one kind of anxiety and exactly the right approach for the other. So let us name them. Normal anxiety, in May's framework, is proportionate to the actual situation. It is what you feel when something genuinely important is uncertain. It motivates rather than paralyzes. It moves with the situation, arriving when circumstances call for it and fading when they pass. And crucially, it does not require you to distort your perception of reality to manage it. You can face the situation, feel the anxiety, and respond. This kind of anxiety is not a disorder. It is a built-in feature of being a conscious person with values and responsibilities and things you care about. It is the feeling before a meaningful conversation, before a significant decision, before something that matters. May believed that a life without this kind of anxiety would not be a healthier life. It would be a smaller one. Neurotic anxiety is different. It arises not from genuine threat, but from threats to possibilities the person cannot allow themselves to acknowledge. It is anxiety that has been generated by avoidance, by repression, by the long habit of not looking at what is actually there. Let your shoulders drop. Let the next breath settle. Neurotic anxiety is disproportionate. It attaches itself to situations that do not warrant it because the actual source of the anxiety is not being addressed. It paralyzes rather than motivates. And over time, it narrows the person's world. They begin to avoid more and more, trying to reduce the number of situations that trigger the feeling, not realizing they are shrinking their life to manage something that is being generated from within. May was careful not to use the word neurotic as a judgment. He meant it precisely. He meant anxiety that has lost its connection to the actual situation because the actual situation is not being faced. Here is the most important thing. Neurotic anxiety is normal anxiety that has been refused. It starts as a legitimate signal, pointing towards something real. But when the signal is repeatedly suppressed, when the person cannot or will not look at what the signal is pointing toward, the signal does not go quiet. It gets louder. It attaches to other things. It spreads. This is why anxiety sometimes feels like it is everywhere and about everything. It may have started as anxiety about one specific thing, one genuine threat, one real facing that needed to happen. But when that facing was refused, the anxiety had nowhere to go except everywhere. The relief, when it comes, does not usually come from quieting the anxiety. It comes from finding what the anxiety was trying to say and saying yes to that. We planted a seed earlier, the two kinds of anxiety. We have arrived. Normal anxiety is a companion to real life. It deserves to be met with honesty, not elimination. Neurotic anxiety is a message that has been lost in translation. It deserves to be traced back to its source. And finally, heard. Which one you are carrying, or whether you are carrying some of both, is something only you can know. But the first step, May always said, is the same. Stop trying to silence the alarm. Start asking what it is pointing toward. Chapter 10. Courage in Uncertainty. Here is something that might surprise you. May did not believe the opposite of anxiety is calm. He believed the opposite of anxiety is courage. Not the dramatic kind of courage. Not the kind that charges into battle or makes sweeping declarations. The quiet kind. The kind that keeps moving even when the direction is not certain. The kind that holds uncertainty without collapsing into it. He wrote at length about what courage actually means in the context of anxiety. He distinguished it carefully from bravado, from recklessness, from the performance of fearlessness. None of those, he said, are courage. They are strategies for avoiding the real feeling. Real courage, in May's understanding, begins with acknowledging the anxiety. Not overcoming it, not suppressing it, acknowledging it. Saying, yes, this is uncertain. Yes, I do not know how this will go. Yes, something in me trembles at the edge of this. And then taking one more step anyway. Notice where your body touches what is beneath you. Feel the contact, the weight, the simple fact of being here. Courage, for May, was not the absence of trembling. It was the willingness to tremble and move forward at the same time. And this distinction matters enormously. Because a culture that confuses courage with fearlessness sends people the wrong message. It tells them that if they feel afraid, they are not ready. That the anxiety is a sign they should wait or retreat or try harder to feel certain before they begin. May would say that if you wait until you are certain, you will wait forever. Certainty is not a prerequisite for a meaningful life. It is a fantasy that anxiety uses to keep us in place. The farmers in the old Taoist story understood this in their own way. A farmer loses his horse. The neighbors say, "What terrible luck!" He says, "Maybe." The horse returns with wild horses. The neighbors say, "What wonderful luck!" He says, "Maybe." His son breaks his leg riding one of the wild horses. The neighbors say, "What terrible luck!" He says, "Maybe." The army comes to conscript young men. His son is passed over because of the broken leg. The neighbors say, "What wonderful luck." The farmer says nothing. What the farmer knows is this: certainty is not available. Judgment must be withheld. And life, with all its uncertainty, must still be lived. That kind of openness to uncertainty, that capacity to act without knowing the outcome, is what May meant by courage in the face of anxiety. It is not passive, it is deeply active. It requires sustained effort. The effort not to collapse into false certainty on one side or paralysis on the other. To stay in the uncertainty and keep choosing. Paul Tillich, who was one of May's closest intellectual companions, called this the courage to be. He meant something specific. The courage to affirm one's own existence in the face of all the forces that threaten it, including the internal forces, including the anxiety itself. The courage to be is not a single dramatic act. It is the sum of 1,000 small movements, each one made in the presence of uncertainty. Each one saying, I am still here. I am still choosing. I have not stopped. That is the courage May believed anxiety was asking for, not the elimination of the feeling, but the willingness to feel it and continue. Chapter 11. The Cost of Avoidance. Let us talk about what happens when we do not listen, when the signal comes and we refuse it, when the anxiety rises and we reach for whatever quiets it fastest, when the feeling points towards something real and we choose again and again not to look. Avoidance works. That is what makes it so seductive. In the short term, it reliably reduces discomfort. Step away from the thing that triggers the anxiety, and the anxiety decreases. The relief is immediate and real, but it comes with a cost that arrives slowly and accumulates quietly, until one day you look up and realize the world you have constructed around your own comfort has become very small. May observed this in his patients with great sadness. Not judgment, sadness. He saw intelligent, perceptive, deeply human people who had spent years building systems of avoidance so elegant they could hardly see them anymore. They had avoided the difficult conversation, the bold choice, the creative risk, the relationship that required too much vulnerability, the work that mattered too much to try and fail at. And each avoidance had felt, in the moment, like wisdom, like knowing your limits, like being realistic. But the cost was the life they were not living. Let your jaw soften for a moment. There is nothing to defend right now. There is a man who fills every hour of his day. You may know someone like this. Possibly you have been someone like this. His schedule is a masterpiece of efficiency. He is always doing, always moving, always available to something that is not himself. Ask him what he is avoiding, and he will look at you with genuine confusion. He is not avoiding anything. He is productive, but one Sunday the schedule is empty. Just one Sunday, by accident, nothing arranged. And he sits with himself for perhaps the first time in years, and something rises. Not a crisis, not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet, persistent question that has been waiting with tremendous patience for this gap in the noise. Is this the life I actually chose? The anxiety he had been outrunning was not a symptom of weakness. It was the question he had been refusing to sit with for years. It was his own center trying to reach him. Avoidance, May said, is not the suppression of anxiety. It is the suppression of the self. Because what the anxiety is usually pointing toward is something real in you, a value that is not being honored, a direction that is calling, a choice that is waiting. When you avoid the anxiety, you avoid the real thing it is trying to show you. and the self, like a signal left unacknowledged, gets quieter, not gone, not resolved. Just quieter, and you get flatter. This is not a condemnation. Most avoidance is not a failure of character. It is a very human response to something that feels genuinely dangerous. But May wanted to name the cost clearly and compassionately, not to frighten, to illuminate. Because once you see the cost, the anxiety begins to look different. It is no longer just uncomfortable. It is also an invitation to something you have been keeping at a distance, to something worth facing. Chapter 12, Overthinking and Inner Division. There is a particular kind of mental suffering that does not announce itself as suffering. It presents as thinking, as careful consideration, as the responsible act of examining all possible outcomes before committing to any of them. But when the thinking circles rather than moves, when the examination goes on for months or years without arriving anywhere, when the same questions are revisited each night with the same inconclusive result, something else is happening. May called it inner division. He meant the experience of being pulled in two directions at once, genuinely and simultaneously, without the strength or clarity to move toward either. On one side, the familiar, the known life, the manageable set of problems it contains. Its limited horizon is also its safety. On the other side, the possible, the life that might exist on the other side of a risk, a change, a facing. Its possibilities are real, but so is its uncertainty. And the person stands between these, thinking in great detail about both. Thinking so much that thinking itself becomes a way of not choosing. The thinking is not the problem. The avoidance dressed as thinking is the problem. And here is where the body becomes the most honest informant. Let your breath come easy. Feel the weight of your body. Let the next breath be slightly slower. May observe that the body registers inner division in ways the mind tries to explain away. The tension in the chest that arrives when you imagine staying in the current situation. The different tension when you imagine leaving it. The way your sleep changes in the weeks when an unresolved choice is pressing. The body is not overthinking. The body already knows. But we have been taught to distrust the body's knowing, to wait until the thinking produces a rationally airtight case for one direction over the other. May would say you may wait a very long time, because in genuine inner division, both sides have legitimate claims. That is why the division is real. Both the familiar and the possible are calling something true in you. And no amount of thinking will produce a final argument that silences the other side. What ends inner division is not thinking harder, it is choosing and accepting that choice is made without certainty. There is also something May noticed in the relationship between overthinking and the inner critic. The mind, divided, tends to turn on itself. The relentless questioning becomes not just about the situation, but about the self. Why can I not decide? What is wrong with me? Other people seem to know what they want, but the inner critic is not a separate problem. It is a symptom of the same division, of the same avoided choice, of the same signal that has not been received. There is a reason it gets louder at night, because the day fills with distraction, with tasks and noise and the gentle numbing of activity. But at night, in the quiet, the mind tries to do what it has been doing all along, pointing toward what needs to be faced. And tomorrow is a new opportunity to decide whether to listen. Chapter 13, Anxiety in Modern Life. Here is something May began to argue in the 1950s, and which has only become more true with each passing decade. Modern life has created conditions that are uniquely suited to producing anxiety, while simultaneously creating an unprecedented number of ways to not feel it. The conditions that produce it are real and worth naming. The fragmentation of community, the erosion of shared meaning, the speed at which everything moves, including the pace at which a person is expected to decide who they are, the absence of the traditional frameworks, religious, communal, cultural, that once gave life a sense of structure and purpose without requiring each person to construct that structure individually. When those frameworks dissolve, freedom expands. And with freedom, as we have seen, comes anxiety. The person standing in the modern world faces a staggering range of choices about who to be, where to live, what to believe, how to spend a life, more options than any previous generation. And no map. That is genuinely difficult. Notice the weight of your body, where it rests. Let your shoulders drop. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. Marcus Aurelius, writing by candlelight in a military tent on the Danube frontier, could not have imagined the specific shape of modern anxiety. But he understood the basic structure. He governed an empire and could not govern his own mind to rest. He wrote not commands, but questions, not to his generals, but to himself. What dies? What remains? What is it that actually matters? He was doing, in his own ancient way, what May would later identify as the essential work, finding the center again, the thing beneath the noise, the self that could not be dissolved by circumstance. The modern problem is that this work, the inward work of finding the center, is harder to do when the outer world demands constant attention, when the phone is always available, when the stream of information never stops, when busyness is coded as success and stillness is coded as falling behind. May wrote late in his career about what he called the hollow person, the individual who has adopted the expectations of the external world so thoroughly that the internal world has gone quiet, not peaceful, quiet, empty. The hollow person is not obviously suffering. They are performing adequately, meeting the requirements, keeping up appearances. But beneath the performance, there is nothing pressing back, no real center, no place where genuine values live and make demands, No self that says this matters and this does not. And without that center, even the reduced form of anxiety that the hollow person experiences has nothing to be about. It floats, untethered, attaching to random surfaces. This is one reason modern anxiety can feel so diffuse, so hard to locate. It may be the anxiety of a self that has been hollowed by years of performing what the world required and has lost touch with what it actually values. May believed the restoration begins with precisely what we are doing right now. Slowing down, turning inward, listening to what is actually there. Even in the dark, especially in the dark. Chapter 14, The Fear of Freedom. There is a freedom most people say they want, but there is also a freedom most people are quietly afraid of, and these are often the same freedom. Rollo May spent years thinking about what he called the fear of freedom, not the desire for constraint, not a masochistic preference for limitation, but something more specific and more human than that. He observed that genuine freedom, the freedom to define your own life, to make choices that are truly yours, to live from your own center rather than from the expectations of others, is accompanied by responsibility on a scale that can feel overwhelming. Because if you are genuinely free, you cannot finally blame anyone else for how your life has gone. That is a weight. And many people, confronted with that weight, unconsciously choose to limit their own freedom, to accept constraints they did not have to accept, to defer to authority they did not have to defer to stay in situations that did not require them to fully choose, not because they are weak, because the alternative, full freedom, full responsibility, is genuinely demanding. Let your breath settle. Let the next breath come just slightly slower. Kierkegaard saw this clearly in his own century. He wrote about what he called the aesthetic life, the life of sensation and pleasure and constant novelty that never requires depth or commitment. And he contrasted it with what he called the ethical life, the life of genuine choosing, genuine responsibility, genuine selfhood. The aesthetic life is more comfortable. The ethical life is more real. But the transition between them, the moment a person moves from one to the other, is almost always accompanied by anxiety, because in the ethical life there is no excuse and no exit. You are choosing. You are responsible. The life that follows is yours. May built on this. He said that many people never quite make this transition. They live on the surface of their own existence, moving from stimulus to stimulus, never quite arriving at the center where genuine choices live. And the anxiety they feel is the pressure of the unlived depth, the weight of the life they are not inhabiting. The fear of freedom is not the fear of being free. It is the fear of being responsible for what that freedom produces. A woman once said to her therapist, "I know exactly what I want to do with my life. I have known for years, and I have not done it." The therapist asked why. She said, "Because if I try and it does not work, then I will have to admit it was my fault." There it is. The fear of freedom is the fear of no longer having a story in which someone or something else is to blame. That story, as uncomfortable as it is, provides a strange comfort. It relieves the weight of responsibility. It makes the anxiety someone else's fault. May gently, persistently ask people to put down that story. Not because the past is not real, not because others have not caused real harm, but because living inside that story is another form of the avoidance we talked about. It keeps the self from making contact with its own power. And without that contact, the freedom remains only theoretical, while the fear of it remains very real. Chapter 15: Therapy and the Human Dilemma. When people talk about therapy, they often imagine a process of removing something, removing the bad feelings, removing the unhelpful patterns, removing the anxiety. Rollo May had a very different picture. He thought of therapy not as subtraction, but as encounter, as the creation of a space in which a person could finally meet themselves honestly, not to be fixed, to be known. This distinction sounds subtle, but it changes everything about how the process works and what success looks like. In a subtractive model, the therapist is essentially a mechanic. There is a problem. The therapist identifies it and removes it. The patient is passive. The cure is applied. In May's model, the therapist is more like a companion on difficult terrain, someone who stays present while the person does the work of genuinely encountering their own life. The work is the patient's. The encounter is the patient's. The courage to face what is there, that must come from within. Feel where your body is resting. Let your jaw soften. There is nothing to fix right now. May argued that the human dilemma, the central tension at the core of human existence, is the tension between being part of something larger and being a separate individual self. Between belonging and individuality. Between the deep need for connection and the equally deep need to be genuinely, distinctly oneself. These two needs are in constant creative tension, and the anxiety that arises at the center of human life is largely the anxiety of navigating this tension. When belonging is threatened, when a person fears rejection or abandonment, anxiety rises. When individuality is threatened, when a person feels their sense of self being eroded or swallowed by others' expectations, anxiety rises. And the therapy May practiced was not about resolving this tension. It was about helping people develop the capacity to hold it, to live inside it without being destroyed by it. This is a much more honest picture of what healing actually looks like. Real healing, in May's view, does not produce a person who no longer feels the tension. It produces a person who has grown large enough to contain it, who has developed the inner resources to stay upright in the presence of genuine uncertainty, genuine conflict, genuine not knowing. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the work of a lifetime. And it cannot be done for you. It can only be done alongside someone who believes you are capable of doing it. May believed with great conviction that every person has this capacity, not that everyone will use it, but that everyone has it. That belief, extended to the person sitting across from him, was itself a form of healing, because most people, by the time they seek help, have stopped believing in their own capacity. The first task is not to remove the anxiety. It is to restore the belief that the person can face whatever the anxiety is pointing toward. And that changes everything that follows. Chapter 16. The courage to create. There is a moment before every creative act that almost no one talks about. It is the moment of genuine uncertainty. Before the first word is written, the first note is played, the first brushstroke is made. Before anything exists that was not there before, there is a space of pure potential. And that space, May argued, is saturated with anxiety. Not because something is going wrong, because something genuine is about to happen. Creation, in May's philosophy, is one of the most direct confrontations with the anxiety of existence that a human being can have. Because to create something is to say, I am here. What I make did not exist before me. My presence in the world has produced something real. And that claim, however quietly made, is an act of profound courage. May wrote an entire book about this. He called it The Courage to Create. And what he argued through that book was that creativity is not a talent reserved for artists. It is a human capacity expressed differently in different lives, but essentially the same thing in all of them. The courage to encounter the world with your whole self, to be changed by what you encounter, and to bring something new into being out of that encounter. Notice where your body is resting. You do not need to do anything, just listen. He drew a distinction that is worth staying with between creating and producing. Production is about efficiency, about output, about making things according to a plan that exists in advance. Production is valuable, but it is not creation. Creation involves genuine uncertainty. The creator does not fully know what they are making until they have made it. They are discovering as they go. And that discovery requires a willingness to not know, to be in the uncertain middle, to tolerate the anxiety of the unfinished. Most people, when they encounter this anxiety, stop. They call it not being creative. They say they are not artists. They put down the thing and return to the comfort of the already known. But May argued that what they are avoiding is not a lack of talent, it is the anxiety of genuine encounter. Carl Jung, in the winter of 1913, was in exactly this kind of place. He had broken with his mentor, Sigmund Freud. His professional reputation was damaged. His inner world was full of voices and images that frightened him. He could have silenced them, could have organized them into a clinical report and kept them at a safe professional distance. Instead, he opened a large red leather notebook and began to write. He spent years filling it with words and images, descending into his own unconscious with the discipline of a scientist and the honesty of a man with nothing left to prove. He called what he was doing active imagination. He called the result the Red Book. He showed it to almost no one for decades, but the courage to create what lived inside him rather than suppress it was the act that produced nearly everything he would later give to the world. Creation, at its deepest, is an act of trust. Trust that what lives inside you is worth encountering, worth bringing out, worth offering. And that trust is an act of courage, not a precondition for it. Chapter 17. Creativity against despair. Despair is a word that deserves to be used carefully. It is not sadness. Sadness is acute and specific. It arrives in response to loss, and eventually, if allowed to move, it moves. Despair is different. It is the belief that nothing can change, that the situation is final, that the self is fixed and the future is closed. May saw despair as one of the greatest threats to human existence, not because it is dangerous in the way that violence is dangerous, but because it quietly extinguishes something essential, the belief that life can be otherwise. And he believed that creativity, in its deepest sense, is one of the most powerful antidotes to despair. Not because creating something makes the problem go away, but because the act of creating anything at all is, in itself, a refusal to accept that the situation is final. When you write something, paint something, cook something, build something, solve something with genuine engagement and care, you are enacting a belief that your actions have meaning, that what you bring into being matters, that the future is not already written. That belief is not small. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Albert Camus understood this from a different angle. He began with what he called the absurd, the fundamental mismatch between human beings who demand meaning and a universe that offers none. He looked at this situation honestly and refused to look away. And then he refused to conclude that despair was the appropriate response. He said, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, watching it roll back down and climbing again forever." Camus said that in the moment of descent, when Sisyphus walks back down to begin again, there is the possibility of something other than despair, the revolt, the refusal to be defeated by the absurdity of it, the happiness, if it can be called that, of a person who knows the situation fully and chooses to act anyway. May connected this to creativity. The creative act is a kind of revolt. It says, "I am here. What I do matters. Even if the universe is indifferent, I am not." He found this in unexpected places. He found it in people who, after devastating losses, returned to the things they loved. Not because the loss was healed, but because the returning itself was a form of courage, a form of protest against the temptation to stop, He found it in people who, deep into their 60s and 70s, began new things, learned instruments, started writing, built something with their hands. Not to achieve mastery, but to feel alive in the making. The making is not separate from the life. It is a concentrated form of it. And in every moment of genuine making, despair recedes slightly, not because the facts have changed, but because the person has remembered that they are not only subject to the facts, they are also an actor in them. Something shifts here, not dramatically, but it shifts. Chapter 18, Love, Will, and Conflict. In 1969, Rollo May published what many consider his most ambitious work. The world was in a particular kind of upheaval that year. The social structures that had organized life in the West were fracturing. Relationships were being renegotiated. The old definitions of love and commitment were being questioned in ways that produced enormous freedom and enormous confusion. May looked at what was happening and wrote a book about what he saw beneath the surface of the cultural moment. He called it Love and Will. His argument was this: the great problem of modern human beings was not too much restriction, though restriction had certainly done damage. The great problem was a disconnection between feeling and meaning, between the capacity to be moved and the capacity to choose deliberately what to do about being moved. In older traditions, love and will had been held together. Love was not merely an emotion. It was a commitment, a decision, a chosen orientation toward another person that did not disappear when the feeling temporarily faded. And will was not mere willpower. It was not gritting your teeth and forcing yourself to do something. It was a living, dynamic engagement with life. An intention that arose from genuine values, not from external pressure. May saw these two capacities, love and will, as interdependent. Neither functions well without the other. Love without will becomes passive. It waits for the feeling rather than tending to the commitment. It confuses intensity with depth. And when the intensity fades, as it always does, it has nothing to sustain it. Let your breath come easy. Let your eyes close if they want to. Will without love becomes coercive, hard and cold, forcing outcomes rather than creating conditions. It loses touch with what actually matters. The anxiety of modern life, May argued, was partly the anxiety of people who had lost access to their own will, who had become excellent at feeling but uncertain about choosing, who had learned to respond to intensity but not to tend to meaning. And alongside this, many had lost access to genuine love, genuine caring. The orientation toward another person or toward life itself that does not depend on mood or circumstance to maintain its basic commitment. Now here is the conflict May identified at the center. Love requires vulnerability, the willingness to be genuinely affected by another person, to allow what happens to them to matter to you in a way that cannot be controlled. Will requires strength, the capacity to choose even when the feeling is not there, to maintain direction even through confusion. These two can feel like opposites, and in the anxiety of not knowing how to hold both, many people collapse into one or the other. The person who can only feel, never quite choosing. The person who can only control, never quite opening. May said the full human life requires both. Not perfectly balanced, but both present. Both in conversation with each other. That conversation is ongoing, and it is one of the most important ones a life can have. Chapter 19, The Burden of Choice. Every choice that you make forecloses other choices. That is not a problem. That is what choosing is. But there is something about the finality of choices that the modern mind finds very difficult. We live in a culture that celebrates optionality, that treats the keeping open of options as a sign of intelligence and wisdom, that frames commitment as a loss rather than a gain. And May would say that this cultural framing is producing a specific and recognizable kind of anxiety. The anxiety of the person who cannot choose, not because they do not care, but because choosing feels like the closing of too many doors at once. He called this the burden of choice. It is heaviest in people who have the most options. A student facing dozens of possible careers. A person in middle age who has achieved enough freedom that nearly anything seems possible. A couple deciding whether to make a commitment that will organize both their lives around each other's presence. In each case, the options are real, but the person stands at the center of them, unable to move, and the immobility is experienced as anxiety. Let your jaw soften. Notice the weight of your body. There is nothing to choose right now. May observe something important about how this burden gets heavier over time. Each year that passes without a genuine choice, each year spent in the holding pattern of preserved options makes choosing harder. Because now the choice carries the weight not only of what comes next, but of all the years that were spent not choosing. The person begins to feel that whatever they choose, they have already wasted something. And that grief, the grief of the deferred decision, makes the choosing feel even more consequential, and therefore even more impossible. He was not impatient about this. He understood it. But he also believed, with great clarity, that the choosing is the life. That a life of deferred choices is not a life held in reserve, it is a life that is passing without being inhabited. The burden of choice is real, but the burden of not choosing is heavier. It accumulates differently. It does not arrive all at once. It comes in small installments. In the feeling each January that another year has gone by without much changing. In the quiet restlessness that lives in the chest of someone who has been very careful not to commit too fully to anything. May had a phrase for the person who had fully accepted the burden of choice and was willing to carry it. He said they had learned to love their fate. Not every detail of it, not the painful parts, but the broad shape of a life deliberately chosen, with all the foreclosed alternatives accepted as the cost of having chosen something real. That acceptance is not resignation. It is the deepest kind of freedom. The freedom of a person who has finally decided to live their actual life rather than the theoretical one in which all options remain open. Chapter 20: Mental Health Beyond Comfort. Here is an idea that runs against almost everything modern culture says about well-being. Mental health is not the absence of anxiety. May made this argument clearly and carefully, and it is worth staying with. The popular understanding of mental health, particularly as it has been shaped by pharmaceutical culture and self-optimization culture, tends toward the goal of comfort. Reduce the uncomfortable feelings. Increase the pleasant ones. Find the diet, the practice, the medication, the routine that keeps the emotional weather mild and manageable. May did not dismiss comfort as worthless. He was not a masochist. He did not believe that suffering was inherently good. But he did believe strongly that comfort is not the goal of a meaningful life, and that a life organized around the avoidance of discomfort is not, by his definition, a mentally healthy life. Mental health, for May, was about something larger. It was about the capacity for genuine encounter, the ability to be actually present to what is happening, to feel what is real, to choose from that feeling, to act with awareness, intention, and care. This sometimes involves discomfort. Notice where your body touches what is beneath you. Feel the contact, just breathe. He distinguished between comfort and peace. They feel similar from the outside, but they are very different from the inside. Comfort is the reduction of friction. Peace is the presence of something underneath the friction. Something steady, something grounded, something that does not depend on external circumstances being arranged just right. Comfort can be achieved by narrowing the world enough that nothing threatening gets in. Peace is earned by going into the threatening things and discovering that you can survive them, that you have resources you did not know you had, that the self is larger than any single fear. Comfort without peace is fragile. One unexpected event can shatter it. Peace without comfort is robust. It does not require perfect conditions. May wanted his patients and his readers to aim for the second thing, not because the path there is easy, but because it is the only version that actually holds. A person who has found genuine peace, by his definition, has not stopped feeling anxiety. They have developed what he called the capacity to use anxiety constructively, to feel the signal without being overwhelmed by it, to let it point toward what is real without letting it run the entire show. That is a skill. It develops over time. It requires practice and patience and, often, significant support. But it is available, even now. Even in the middle of a night when the mind is full of noise. The peace that May pointed toward does not require the noise to stop. It only requires that you stop mistaking the noise for the whole picture. Chapter 21: Loneliness and the Isolated Self. There is a loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded by people in a full room at a table with people who know you well and still feel it, that particular hollowness, that sense of being present without being fully met. Rollo May wrote about loneliness with unusual honesty. He did not treat it as a social problem with a social solution. He understood it as an existential condition, built into the structure of being a self, because to be a self is to be distinct, and distinction, however necessary, means that no other person can ever fully inhabit your experience. No matter how close the relationship, how deep the love, how long the knowing, there is always a final distance, a place in you that no one else can reach. That is not a failure of any particular relationship. It is the nature of what it means to be a separate consciousness. And the anxiety that comes from that recognition, the loneliness beneath even the fullest life, is one of the most common and least spoken experiences in human existence. Let your shoulders drop. Let the next breath come slowly. There is nothing you need to fix about this. May distinguish between two kinds of aloneness. There is aloneness that is experienced as abandonment, as proof that one is not lovable or not interesting or not worth staying for. This aloneness is painful in a particular way. It generates the frantic need to fill the space with people or noise or stimulation. And there is aloneness that is experienced as solitude, as the encounter with one's own depth, as the quiet that is necessary for any genuine self to have room to exist. The second kind of aloneness is not loneliness. It is something closer to home. Many people never develop a relationship with their own aloneness that is anything other than fearful. They experience any space without external input as threatening. They have confused the presence of other people with the presence of the self. But the self, May would say, can only be found in solitude, not exclusively, not permanently, but necessarily, at intervals, in the quiet where the external demands go quiet enough for the real interior to be heard. He thought of this as one of the most important skills a person could develop, the capacity to be alone without being lonely, to inhabit the quiet without being devoured by it. Henry David Thoreau, in the summer of 1845, moved to a small cabin by a pond in Massachusetts. He was not fleeing people, he was going in search of himself. And what he found in that solitude was not emptiness, it was spaciousness. The aloneness stopped being something to be endured and became something to be inhabited. He found that when the social performance was set aside, something genuine could exist in its place, something quieter, something more his. May saw this as the healthy encounter with existential loneliness. Not the denial of it, not the performance of not needing others, but the honest acceptance of the final distance alongside the full-hearted engagement with connection wherever it is real, both at once. Neither cancelling the other. That is the full life he was pointing toward. Chapter 22, The Inner Critic at Night. You probably know this voice. It arrives when the day is done and the last defense against it has been removed, when the distractions have been set aside and the room has gone quiet and there is nothing left between you and the thing you have been carrying. It speaks in the second person, or sometimes in the first, and it says things that no kind person would say to another human being. Things about adequacy, about failure, about all the ways you have not been enough. The inner critic is not your voice, or rather, it is your voice, but it is not speaking from your center. It is speaking from someone else's standards that you absorbed long ago and have been applying to yourself ever since. Rollo May understood the inner critic as one of the primary instruments of what he called neurotic anxiety, because the inner critic generates anxiety that is not about a genuine threat. It is about a perceived inadequacy relative to a standard that may not even be one you actually chose. It rehearses past failures not to learn from them, but to establish again and again that the self is fundamentally insufficient. This is not useful, but it is very loud. Let your jaw soften. Let the next breath be just a little slower. There is nothing you need to prove right now. At 2 a.m, a mind runs through its ledger. The conversation that went badly, the task left undone, the thing you said to someone you love that came out wrong and has been sitting in your chest ever since, the opportunity you did not take, the care you meant to give but let slip in the busyness of the day. The mind treats each of these as evidence. Evidence for a verdict it has already reached. But what if the ledger is not evidence of inadequacy? What if it is evidence of caring? The inner critic is loudest in the people who care the most, who take their responsibilities seriously, who feel the gap between the person they are and the person they are trying to become. People who do not care do not have inner critics, or their critics are very quiet. The inner critic, for all its cruelty, is a distorted form of something genuine, a real desire to live well, to treat people well, to be the kind of person whose presence in the world is a good thing. What is distorted is not the caring, but the application of the caring. The critic takes the desire for goodness and turns it into an instrument of punishment rather than growth. May would say the first step is to notice this, to hear the critic and ask, what does this voice actually want for me? Beneath the cruelty usually is a desire for something real, for competence, for kindness, for integrity, for meaning. Those are not bad things to want, but the critic's method, condemnation and punishment, and relentless accumulation of evidence against, does not produce any of them. It produces only anxiety and contraction. The voice that actually moves a person toward becoming better is not the inner critic. It is something quieter, something more patient, something closer to a gentle friend who believes in your capacity and calls you toward it with warmth, rather than driving you away from failure with shame. Tonight, if the critic speaks, you might just notice it. Not argue with it, not submit to it. Just notice it the way you would notice rain, and let it pass. Chapter 23. Anxiety and Lost Meaning. There is a kind of anxiety that does not have a clear object. It is not about a specific situation or a particular threat. It is more ambient than that. A background hum that does not resolve into a clear note. A sense that something is missing without being able to say exactly what. May identified this as one of the most significant forms of anxiety in modern life, and he traced its roots to a specific cause: the loss of meaning. He did not mean this in a dramatic or philosophical sense. He was not talking about people who had confronted nihilism and despaired. He was talking about something much quieter and more ordinary. The experience of waking up inside a life that functions adequately, that contains all the expected components, job, relationships, routines, and realizing that the life no longer feels inhabited from the inside. The structure is there, but the meaning that made the structure feel worthwhile has quietly left. When this happens, the anxiety that follows is particularly difficult to address, because there is no specific threat to identify, no particular change to make, no clear action that would fix it. The problem is not a problem. The problem is an absence. Notice the weight of your body. There is nothing to fix right now. Just listen. Viktor Frankl observed something similar from a very different angle. In the extremity of the concentration camps, he noticed that people who maintained a connection to meaning, even in circumstances of maximum suffering, sustained a quality of inner life that those without it could not. Not because meaning made the suffering bearable in a comfortable sense, but because it gave the suffering somewhere to go, a purpose, a reason that organized the experience around something larger than the experience itself. When meaning is present, even great difficulty can be endured. When meaning is absent, even adequate circumstances feel hollow. May took this observation and applied it to modern life. He argued that the epidemic of anxiety he observed in his patients was not primarily caused by the specific difficulties of their lives. It was caused by the absence of a felt sense of meaning that made those difficulties worthwhile. The person working a job they have no genuine investment in, maintaining relationships they feel little real connection to, moving through days that feel like obligations rather than choices, that person is not necessarily in a worse circumstance than their neighbor who wakes up each morning with a sense of direction and purpose. But the first person experiences far more ambient anxiety, because meaning, May believed, is not a luxury. It is a structural need. Without it, the self has nothing to organize around, nothing to be in service of. And in that absence, the anxiety that arises is the anxiety of a self without orientation, a compass with no north. The recovery of meaning does not come from philosophical argument or from thinking very hard about what matters. It comes from the same place anxiety comes from contact with what actually moves you, from the things you care about when no one is watching, from the activities and relationships and ideas that make you feel more real, not less. Those things are not lost. They are waiting. Chapter 24, Confronting the Void. There is a question underneath the anxiety that most people spend their entire lives not quite asking. What if nothing means anything? What if the structures of meaning I have built are just structures? Social agreements, cultural inheritances, personal narratives. I have told myself so many times they feel like facts. What if, beneath all of that, there is just empty space? This is the void. May did not flinch from it. He thought flinching from it was part of the problem. He argued that many of the most difficult forms of anxiety, the kind that does not respond to reassurance, that returns again and again no matter what changes are made, has its root here, in the unacknowledged encounter with the fact of existence without guaranteed meaning. He did not say this to frighten. He said it because he believed that the encounter with the void, when made honestly and without turning away, is itself transformative. Not because the void turns out to be less empty than feared, but because the person who can stand in the presence of genuine uncertainty and not collapse has discovered something about their own capacity they did not know they had. Let your breath settle where it is. Feel the weight of your body against what is beneath you, just here, just now. The philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote in the 17th century that all of humanity's problems arise from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was not being glib. He was pointing at precisely this: the void that appears in silence. The thing we are all fleeing when we fill our days with noise and activity and social performance. May would say the same thing differently. He would say that the anxiety of the void, the anxiety that arises when all the familiar structures are removed and you are left with just yourself and the bare fact of existence, is not a signal that something has gone wrong. It is the signal that something has gone quiet enough for the real encounter to begin. The encounter with the void is the encounter with freedom at its most fundamental. Here, stripped of every temporary reassurance, is the self. Here, stripped of every borrowed meaning, is the question. What will you make of this? Not the universe, not the abstract situation, just this life, this awareness, this singular, unrepeatable hour. And May's answer to the void was not an argument for meaning, it was an act of courage. The act of choosing to value, to care, to create, to commit, in full knowledge that none of it is cosmically guaranteed. Camus called this revolt. May called it the courage to be. By different names, they were pointing at the same thing. The void does not have to be the last word, but to get past it, you have to look at it first. And here, in the quiet, you might be looking at it now. Chapter 25. Existential guilt and responsibility. There is a guilt that goes deeper than anything you have done. May called it existential guilt. He distinguished it carefully from moral guilt, which arises when we have genuinely violated a value we hold. Moral guilt is appropriate and, when acknowledged and learned from, leads to repair and growth. Existential guilt is different. It is the guilt of the unused potential, the guilt of the life not fully inhabited, the guilt that arises not from what we have done, but from what we have not allowed ourselves to become. This kind of guilt is not loud. It does not announce itself with the specific accusations that moral guilt makes. It is quieter, more diffuse. It tends to arrive in certain kinds of moments. When you stand in the presence of someone living with a fullness you feel you have not quite managed. When you finish a book that moves you in a way that ordinary life does not. When you notice, at the end of a decade, that something you always meant to do has still not been done. That quiet pressure, that faint shame without a specific cause. That is existential guilt, and May believed it is one of the most important signals in the entire landscape of anxiety. Notice the weight of your body. Let your shoulders drop. There is nothing to be ashamed of in this moment. Existential guilt is not punishment. It is information. It is the inner voice of the self telling you that there is more of you available than you have been using, that the life you are living is real, but it is not the whole story. That something in you is still reaching, still wanting, still offering more than the current arrangement allows. When taken seriously, rather than suppressed or converted into self-recrimination, existential guilt becomes one of the most productive forms of inner life. Because it is specific. Even when it feels diffuse, it is pointing somewhere. Toward the unlived dimension. Toward the creative work not done. Toward the relationship not fully entered. Toward the person you have been in the process of becoming but have not yet allowed to arrive. May thought that the healthy response to existential guilt is not to punish yourself for the unlived life. It is to begin to live it as much as is possible from exactly where you are. Not dramatically, not all at once. The teacher who finally begins to write the things she has been thinking about for 20 years. The father who finally tells his grown children what he actually feels about them. The man who puts down the anesthesia of the full schedule for one Sunday and asks himself what he actually wants. Each of these small beginnings is a response to existential guilt that transforms it from a wound into a direction. It is not too late for any of this. That is the part May wanted most to be heard. The existential guilt is not evidence that the window has closed. It is evidence that the window is still open. And you are standing in front of it right now. Chapter 26. The Search for Identity. Who are you when no one is watching? Not the version you present at work or in the family gathering or in the careful performance of daily social life. Not the person you are when there is an audience, however small. Who are you in the quiet? In the room where there is no one to manage, no impression to make, no role to maintain. That question is the search for identity, and it is, in Rollo May's framework, one of the central tasks of a human life. He did not think identity is something you find. He thought it is something you build, continuously, through choices made and owned, through values identified and acted from, through the slow, imperfect, sometimes painful work of discovering what you actually believe rather than what you were told to believe. Identity, for May, is not a destination, it is a practice. And the anxiety that arises in the search for it is not a sign the search is going wrong. It is a sign the search is real. Let your jaw soften. Feel the weight of your body. Nothing needs to be discovered tonight. He was writing during a period of enormous cultural shift, and he saw what that shift was producing in the people who came to him for help. Many had grown up inside structures, religious, familial, professional, that had provided identity without requiring the individual to actually choose it. You were someone because of where you came from, what your family was, what your community expected. These structures had their limitations. They could be confining. They could require conformity at the cost of the individual's genuine self. But when they dissolved, as they were dissolving in May's era and have continued to dissolve, what they left behind was not simply freedom. They left behind a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the question of identity became not a philosophical curiosity, but an urgent practical problem. Who am I? What do I actually believe? What do I actually want? What is the life I would choose if I could choose from my own center rather than from inherited expectation? These are not easy questions, and the anxiety they produce is not irrational. The stakes are genuine. A man in his early 50s once said to his therapist that he had spent 30 years being what everyone needed him to be, and he was good at it. He had built a successful life by it. But I have no idea, he said, who I actually am. The therapist did not offer him a ready-made answer, because there is no ready-made answer. What she offered instead was the question and the space to sit with it without having to immediately resolve it. That sitting, that patient staying with the question of identity is itself part of the answer. Because a self that is willing to ask the question and stay in the asking is already more real than a self that has never asked. The search is not separate from the finding. The search is a form of it. Chapter 27. Trauma, Fear, and Fragmentation. There is a kind of anxiety that is not a signal pointing forward. It is a signal pointing backward to something that has not yet been processed, to an experience that arrived faster than the self could metabolize it and has been sitting, partly undigested, in the body and the memory ever since. May was thoughtful about trauma. He did not reduce it to a clinical category. He thought of it as what happens when the self is overwhelmed by an experience that is too large for its current resources to hold. And the anxiety that follows traumatic experience is in a way the most literal form of May's theory. It is the signal of a genuine threat. The threat that the overwhelming experience will happen again. The threat that the self is not safe. The threat that the world does not have the stability that was once assumed. These are not irrational fears. They are learned responses to real events. The fragmentation that can follow trauma, the sense of being divided, of not quite feeling whole, of having a past that does not connect smoothly to a present. That fragmentation is real. Notice the weight of your body. Let your breath settle. You are safe right now. May believed that the work of healing in the wake of overwhelming experience is not the work of erasing the experience. That is not possible. The body, as Bessel van der Kolk later documented in great detail, holds what has happened to it. The nervous system remembers even when the conscious mind prefers not to. What is possible, May argued, is integration, the gradual, patient work of bringing the overwhelming experience into a narrative that the self can hold. Not a narrative that makes the experience acceptable or justifies it, or denies its impact, but a narrative in which the self is present as a survivor, as a person who was affected but not destroyed, as someone whose experience is part of their story rather than a rupture in the story. Integration does not mean the anxiety disappears. It means the anxiety becomes less dominant, less automatic, less capable of pulling the self entirely back into the overwhelming moment. The self gains what May called a degree of separation from the experience, enough to look at it rather than only through it. This is slow work. It requires safety, it requires support, it cannot be rushed. But May wanted people to know it is possible. He had seen it happen in people who had experienced genuine devastation, who had been through things that no person should have to go through, and who, in time, with patience and support and the willingness to face what had happened rather than live around it, had found a way to carry the experience without being entirely defined by it. The self, he believed, has a remarkable capacity for integration, even after the most difficult things. Chapter 28, Self-Worth and the Courage to Stand. Here is one of the most persistent lies that anxiety tells. It says, your worth is conditional. It says, your worth depends on your performance, on how useful you are to others, on your productivity, your achievements, your ability to meet the expectations that have been placed on you. And when you fail to meet those expectations, the anxiety says, you see, this is the evidence you needed. You are not enough. Rollo May spent a great deal of his work pushing back against this lie, not aggressively, gently, but with great persistence. He argued that the conditional model of self-worth is one of the primary generators of neurotic anxiety, because conditions change, performance fluctuates, expectations shift. And if your sense of worth rises and falls with all of these, you are in a perpetual state of low-grade threat. Something always might go wrong that will take the worth away. And so the anxiety never fully settles. It waits at the edge of every evaluation, every interaction, every moment in which you might be found wanting. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders drop. Nothing is being evaluated right now. The courage to stand, as May understood it, is not the courage to perform perfectly. It is the courage to affirm your own worth independent of performance. This sounds simple. It is profoundly difficult, because most of us received, early and often, a very different message. Love and approval arrived when we did well and withdrew when we did not. Worth was modeled as something earned rather than something inherent. The child who internalized this model grew into an adult who still measures their worth each day against the same conditional scale. May did not say this to assign blame. He said it to explain where the anxiety is rooted and to suggest that the root can be changed. Not quickly, not without help, not without practicing over many repetitions the experience of granting yourself the basic dignity of unconditional worth. Brené Brown, who spent years researching shame and vulnerability, found something that directly confirms May's insight. The people who showed the highest levels of genuine well-being, the people she called wholehearted, were not the most accomplished or the most admired. They were the people who had developed the capacity to believe in their own worth without requiring external evidence to sustain it. They had found something inside themselves that the performance of external approval could not create. They had found what May called the courage to stand, and it looked like this. Like knowing, in the quiet of a room when no one is watching, that your presence in the world is a valid thing, that you belong here, not because you have earned it today, but because belonging is not something that has to be earned. It is something that can be accepted. That is a practice. And tonight is a moment in the practice. Chapter 29, The Desire to Escape. There is a fantasy that most people carry somewhere in them. It looks different for different people. A different life in a different city, a different job, a different version of the choices that led here, a simpler existence, somewhere quieter, somewhere with fewer obligations. The fantasy of starting over. May understood this fantasy. He did not dismiss it, but he was honest about what it is usually carrying. The desire to escape is almost never a desire to leave the actual circumstances. It is a desire to leave the anxiety, to find a life in which the feeling of pressure and inadequacy and unresolved tension does not exist. And May would say, gently, that such a place does not exist. Not because the current circumstances are the only possible ones. Change is real. Moving, changing careers, ending relationships, beginning new things, all of these can be genuinely transformative. But the anxiety travels with you, not because there is something wrong with you, because anxiety is part of the experience of being a conscious person with values and responsibilities and genuine freedom. It goes where you go. It arises wherever you are genuinely alive. Notice where your body is resting. Feel the contact, the weight, the simple reality of being here. The desire to escape, when examined honestly, is often the desire to escape the self. To be somewhere the self's unresolved questions are no longer pressing, where the things you have been avoiding are not available to be avoided. But no geography arranges for this. No new beginning eliminates the questions you came with. What changes, with genuine change, is not the escape from anxiety, but the relationship to it. A person who moves to a new city for good reasons, out of a genuine desire to grow and build something new, may feel the same anxiety in the new city that they felt in the old one, but they are meeting it with the dignity of having chosen deliberately. A person who moves for escape, running from rather than moving toward, finds the old anxiety waiting at the new address. And now there is also the anxiety of having run and still not being free. May thought the desire to escape was worth taking seriously as information. It is telling you that something in the current arrangement is genuinely in conflict with something you need. But the response to that information is not usually geographical. It is usually the harder thing, the staying, the looking, the asking what, specifically in this life, is the source of the unbearable pressure. And from that asking, genuinely heard, something can finally begin to shift. Chapter 30, Facing Death, Choosing Life. Here is something the Stoic philosophers understood, and that modern culture works very hard to obscure. Death is real. Not as an abstract category, not as something that happens to other people, but as a genuine fact about the life you are living, as a horizon that is always there, whether or not you are looking at it. Rollo May, like the existentialist thinkers he drew from, believed that the awareness of death is not a morbid distraction, it is a clarifying force. When you hold the fact of your own finitude clearly enough, long enough, seriously enough, something happens to the way you see the present. It sharpens. The ordinary things that you were too busy to notice become more vivid. The relationship you have been meaning to tend to becomes more urgent, not in a frantic way, but in a caring way. The creative work you have been deferring becomes something worth beginning today, rather than postponing to a more convenient time that may not arrive. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself each morning to remember this. You could leave life right now, he told himself. Let that determine what you do and say and think. He was not practicing morbidity, he was practicing attention. Let your breath come easy. Let the next breath settle. You are here, right now, in this quiet. May's version of this insight was less stark but equally serious. He argued that the anxiety of death, which underlies so many other forms of anxiety, is not something to be suppressed. It is something to be faced, and in being faced, it can be transformed from a source of terror into a source of vitality. The psychologist Irvin Yalom, who built substantially on May's work, spent a career sitting with people who were dying. And he found over and over that when people genuinely confronted their mortality, not as an abstraction, but as a real fact of their own lives, something remarkable happened. They began to make different choices. Choices that moved toward what actually mattered. They stopped spending energy on the concerns that had seemed urgent from within the assumption of infinite time. The approval of people they did not really care about, the outcomes of conflicts that would not be remembered in 20 years, the maintenance of a self-image that required constant management, and they moved toward the simpler, more direct things: connection, honesty, presence, the creative act, the conversation that mattered. This is what May meant when he said that facing death is choosing life, not the life you were supposed to want, not the life that looks right from the outside, the life that actually belongs to you. That life is available now, tonight, in this room. Even the act of slowing down enough to hear it is already a form of choosing it. Chapter 31. The Unlived Life. There is a phrase that appears in Carl Jung's writing that has stayed with many people who have encountered it. He described what he called the unlived life, not as a regret or a failure, but as a presence. A weight that a person carries not from the past, but from the future that was not taken. Rollo May came to a similar insight through a different door. He observed in his patients and in himself that much of the most persistent anxiety is not generated by what has happened, but by what has not been allowed to happen. The expression that was held back, the direction that was not taken, the self that began to emerge and then was pushed down, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient or frightening or too uncertain to trust. These unlived things do not go away. They press, and the pressing is experienced as anxiety. Let your jaw soften. Let your eyes close if they want to. Just breathe. He worked with a woman in her late 60s who had been a gifted musician in her youth. Not professionally, but genuinely gifted. Playing gave her something that nothing else did. She had married young, and the playing had been set aside. Not forbidden, just set aside. For the children, for the schedule, for the practical demands of a real life. And for decades, it had stayed set aside. When she came to May, she was anxious in a way she could not account for. Her life was stable, her health was adequate, her relationships were by most measures fine. But she carried this persistent weight. He asked her about joy. What brought her genuine joy? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said the name of a piece of music she had once played. He suggested she go home and play it. She came back the next week and said, "I forgot that was me." The unlived life had not disappeared. It had been waiting. This is what May wanted to say, with all the care he could bring to it. The life you have not yet lived is not gone. It is waiting in you. In the interests that survived the years of setting them aside. In the curiosity that never quite died. In the skill you thought you had lost, but that comes back. A little rusty, a little uncertain, but unmistakably alive. The anxiety that comes from the unlived life is not a verdict on the past. It is an invitation to the present. You do not have to reclaim everything. You do not have to make the dramatic gesture. You do not have to begin from the beginning. But the first note, the first sentence, the first step back towards something that has been waiting, that is available now. Chapter 32. Anxiety as Awakening. Here is the inversion that May's entire work points toward. What if anxiety, rather than being the thing that keeps you from living, is the thing that is trying to wake you into living? What if the discomfort you have been trying to manage is not an obstacle to the life you want, but the signal that the life you want is close enough to feel? This is the core of May's understanding of what anxiety, at its deepest, is doing. It is not a malfunction. It is a form of aliveness. It is the inner world trying to get the attention of the outer behavior, trying to say, something real is happening here, something worth paying attention to. Do not go back to sleep. Now, he was careful not to romanticize suffering. He knew that anxiety can be debilitating, that it can narrow life, distort perception, and produce genuine misery. He was not asking people to be grateful for their pain, but he was asking them to reconsider its meaning. Notice the weight of your body. Feel the contact between your body and what it rests on. Let the next breath come slowly. The story of Dostoevsky standing in front of a firing squad in December of 1849 is one of the most striking illustrations of what happens when mortality, the most intense form of existential anxiety, is genuinely confronted. He was 28 years old. He had been condemned to death for political activities. He stood in a public square in St. Petersburg in the cold, watching the rifles raised. And then, at the last moment, a messenger arrived with a commuted sentence. Dostoevsky fell to his knees. And later he wrote many times in many forms about what those seconds had given him, not just the relief of survival, something more specific. A clarity about the preciousness of each ordinary moment that he had never had before. Every page he wrote afterward, for the rest of his life, was inflected with that clarity, that awareness, that the present moment is not a waiting room for something better, it is the entire thing. The anxiety of his sentence, at its most extreme, had awakened him. May did not ask anyone to stand in front of a firing squad. He asked something much simpler. He asked people to let the anxiety they were already carrying be a real signal rather than a noise to be managed. To ask, what is this pointing toward? And to let the answer, however uncomfortable, begin to inform the life. Because the awakening the anxiety is offering is not dramatic. It does not require crisis or catastrophe. It requires only the willingness to listen. And you have been listening. Chapter 33, Becoming Through Struggle. May never promised that the path forward would be comfortable. He was honest about this. The encounter with genuine anxiety, the choice to listen rather than suppress, the willingness to face the things the anxiety is pointing toward, none of this is easy. It is a form of struggle. But he distinguished carefully between two kinds of struggle. One is the struggle of avoidance, the continuous effort of keeping the anxiety at bay, the management of symptoms without addressing the source, the building and maintaining of systems designed to ensure the signal is never too loud. This struggle is exhausting, and it never ends. Because the source is never addressed, the anxiety continues to generate, and the management becomes a second full-time job. The other is the struggle of encounter, the willingness to face what the anxiety is pointing toward, even when facing it is uncomfortable, to make the choice that felt too uncertain, to have the conversation that felt too risky, to begin the thing that might fail, to let yourself be known in a relationship in a way that makes you genuinely vulnerable. This struggle is also uncomfortable, but it moves. Let your breath settle. There is nothing to struggle with right now. Just rest. May believe deeply in the human capacity for growth through genuine difficulty. He had seen it in his patients. He had found it in a quieter way, in his own experience of illness and recovery. He had found it in the thinkers he admired most, in Kierkegaard, who struggled with the weight of his own freedom and turned the struggle into some of the most honest writing in the history of philosophy. In Frankl, who struggled with the most unimaginable circumstances and came out with a deeper understanding of meaning than most people ever reach. In Camus, who looked at the absurd honestly and turned it into a philosophy of creative revolt. These were not people who avoided struggle. They were people who went through it with their eyes open. And what came out on the other side was not the absence of difficulty. It was an increased capacity, a larger container for experience, a self that had been tested and found more resilient than it had previously known. May thought this was available to everyone, not in the dramatic form that historical figures model, in the quieter form of everyday courage. The person who finally has the hard conversation. The person who begins, after years of deferral, the creative work that matters. The person who lets themselves rest without guilt, not because they have earned it, but because they have chosen it. Each of these is a small becoming. Each is a form of growth through the struggle of honest encounter. And each changes, slightly but permanently, what the self knows it can do. Chapter 34. The quiet strength of presence. There is a strength that does not look like strength. It does not raise its voice or make large gestures. It does not perform conviction or display certainty. It does not fill the room with evidence of its own solidity. It simply stays. This is what May pointed toward when he talked about what he sometimes called full presence. The capacity to be genuinely, completely in the moment you are in, not performing being present, not documenting the experience for later, not managing how the moment appears to others. Actually being there, in the body, in the feeling, in the full texture of whatever is happening. May thought that full presence is both very simple and very rare, and that its rarity is directly connected to the anxiety we carry. Because anxiety is almost always about time. About the past we are reviewing, the future we are bracing for, the alternative scenarios we are rehearsing. It is almost never about what is actually happening right now. And so, the anxious mind is almost never fully present. It is somewhere else. usually in a future that might go badly or a past that should have gone differently. Let your jaw soften. Let your breath come easy. Feel the weight of your body in this moment. This moment. Just this one. The quietest form of courage, May believed, is the courage to be fully here. Not in the past, not in the future. In whatever is actually present in this room, in this body, in this hour. Because presence, genuine presence, removes the anxiety of the not yet and the no longer. It leaves only what is. And what is, in almost every moment, is more manageable than the imagination suggests. The body that is resting, the air that is moving, the quiet that is here. This is enough for right now. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher who lived through exile and war with a quality of gentleness that astonished those who knew him, wrote something that cuts directly to this. He said that feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky, and that conscious breathing is the anchor, not a solution, an anchor. The breath does not solve anything, but it brings you back to the body, back to the present, back to what is actually here, rather than what the mind is predicting or rehearsing. And in that return, the anxiety, which lives primarily in the imagined future, loses some of its purchase. Just slightly, just enough. May wanted people to know that the quiet strength of presence is not passive. It is a practice. It requires the willingness to keep returning again and again when the mind drifts into its predictions and its rehearsals. But each return builds something, a slightly stronger capacity to be here, a slightly less complete authority for the anxious imagination over the experiencing self, a slightly larger sense of what this moment, this actual present moment, actually contains, which is always, in the end, more than the anxiety says it is. Chapter 35. A Slower Way to Courage. Let us pause here for a moment, not to fix anything, not to resolve anything, just to practice, very gently, the kind of courage May was talking about. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that requires enormous will and decisive action, the quiet kind, the kind that begins in the body and asks only one thing: to be here. Right now, your body is supporting you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your shoulders, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow, maybe your legs, resting where they rest. There is nothing to change there. Just notice. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Not deeper or slower than it wants to go, just the rhythm it has already found. Let it be. Now, if there is an anxiety in you tonight, you do not need to push it away. Just notice it. Notice where it lives in the body. Not what it is saying, not what it is warning you about, just where it sits. Chest, stomach, throat. Place it on a shelf across the room, gently. the way you would set down something fragile. It is still there. You have not erased it. You are just not gripping it. Notice the distance. Now, in that slight space between you and the feeling, let one slow breath arrive. You are not your anxiety. You are the one noticing it. And the one noticing has always been calmer than the one feeling. The one noticing is your center. The place May would recognize, the place from which genuine courage comes. Not bravado, not forced positivity, not the performed absence of fear, just the willingness to be here with what is actually here and to not run. That is enough. Let your jaw go soft. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of your body settle into what is beneath it. The anxiety may still be on the shelf, but you are here, breathing, present, and for tonight, that is the only courage that is needed. When you are ready, we will continue. Chapter 36, Resting Inside Uncertainty. We began tonight with a feeling, that hum, that pressure, that thought without a name that arrives when the day has gone quiet and there is finally space for it. And we have spent these hours not trying to make it stop, but trying to understand what it has been saying. Rollo May believed, with the kind of conviction that comes from a lifetime of honest looking, that anxiety is one of the most important signals in the landscape of human experience. Not the only one, not always the most pleasant one, but one that deserves to be received, because what it is always pointing toward is something real, a value under pressure, a choice waiting to be made, a self that is reaching towards something more true, a life that wants to be lived more fully than the current arrangement allows. Or sometimes simply the fundamental fact of freedom, the fact that you are here, conscious, responsible, and capable of choosing, and that the choosing, for all its discomfort, is the very thing that makes a life genuinely yours. Let your breath settle. Let your eyes close. Let the weight of your body be held by whatever is beneath it. He spent a life in service of one thing, not making people comfortable, making people more real, more genuinely themselves, more capable of meeting the anxiety of their own freedom and choosing from that meeting to move forward. That is what we have been practicing tonight. And now, before we rest, a path forward, not dramatic, not demanding, just 7 small invitations, one for each of the next 7 days, into the quieter kind of courage. Day 1. Tomorrow, when the anxiety arrives, try something different from your usual response. Not elimination, just noticing. Notice where it is in your body. Notice what it feels like before you try to name what it is about. Just for a few seconds, let it be there without fighting it. That is enough for day 1. Day 2. Somewhere in the day, ask yourself this question. What is this feeling trying to protect? Not what is it warning you about in practical terms, but what does it care about on your behalf? The answer might surprise you. Let it be incomplete. The question is the practice. Day 3. Find one small place in your life where you have been avoiding something. Not the biggest thing, the smallest. A conversation you have been deferring, a task you have been looking past, a feeling you have been rooting around. And take one small step toward it. Not the whole thing, just one step. Notice what happens in your body when you do. Day 4. Take 10 minutes today to do nothing purposeful, not to rest in preparation for more productivity, just to stop. And in that stopping, notice what arises. What thought comes when the busyness goes quiet? What question is waiting? You do not have to answer it. Just notice it. Day 5. Say one true thing today to someone who knows you. Not a confession, not a dramatic revelation, just something genuine that you would normally soften or redirect. Something closer to the actual center of what you feel or think or believe. Notice how it feels to be, for one moment, a little less managed. Day 6. Spend a few minutes with something that has given your life meaning, the relationship, the work, the creative interest, the value that you did not acquire from expectation but from genuine encounter. And let yourself feel the connection to it. Let it be real for a moment, without the performance of doing anything about it. Just feeling it. Day 7. Before you sleep, ask yourself gently, with no self-judgment attached, what is one thing I am becoming that I did not know I was becoming a year ago? And let the answer come without demanding it be large or impressive. Sometimes becoming is very quiet. Sometimes it is just the absence of a question you used to ask every day. And on this night, when you close your eyes, you might carry something May worked his whole life to offer. Not that the anxiety will stop, but that you know now what it has been trying to say. You are here, you are choosing, you are free. And the trembling that comes with that freedom is not a flaw. It is the signal that something real is alive in you, something worth listening to, something worth beginning. Let the room go quiet now. Let the breath be the only thing that needs to happen. You can set down the alarm. You have heard what it came to say, and what it said was this: you are still becoming, and that is enough.